Hi there, this is Cathy Wells. I am coming to you from Decatur, Texas, on behalf of Classical Educators of North Texas, and I am talking to Adrienne Freas on behalf of Classical Education. Is that the official name of your group?
Yeah, it's facebook.com/groups/classical education.
Okay.
Mhm.
And so we're just going to take a few moments to describe what we mean by classical education. I'm going to let Adrienne do that. I'm also going to let her introduce herself, who she is, what she's doing. And I consider her to be an expert in this area. So I really wanted to get with her and just hear from her. Hey, what are your thoughts on this? So Adrienne, take it away.
Thanks, Cathy. Well, Cathy and I have known each other for a few years, and it's been a delight to get to know Cathy and her heart. And she has a passionate heart for beautiful, good, and true education. And that is at the heart of classical education. And I've never actually sat down and wrote down a definition of classical education, but I've read many, 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 many. And it's very difficult to define. And in fact, what's interesting is when you look at the tradition, and by that I mean back to the ancient fathers of classical education. So by that I mean Plato, Socrates, obviously, Aquinas, even back there, Augustine. Augustine's much earlier than Aquinas. But looking at those ancient fathers of the classical tradition and the trajectory from which they came up through, there were a lot of they argued about what classical education was, which is
Mm,
why Socrates was executed, right? Because they were arguing back then what is a good, virtuous education. And so it really seems to me that it's part of human nature to argue what is education.
yeah.
And then within the circle of classical education, that argument is still happening. It's never really stopped. And I think it's because education is sacred. I think it's
Oh,
because the
I
human
love that.
soul, I think it's because the human soul is so sacred because we were created in the image of God that the enemy has his clutches on it, right? And so we all of course were created in the nature in image of God, but we also all have this fallen nature. And so from that fallen nature we have these clutches around us that confuse us, right? And so I have not ever attempted to define classical education because I don't ever want to put it in a box. I feel that putting humanity into a box is wrong. I think that the soul of a human person is so sacred that it would be wrong to put it into a definition or a box. And
Wow.
it's okay to embrace mystery. That's another thing. There is one of my favorite quotes from Charlotte Mason, and your listeners don't know this, but people who follow my Facebook page know I am a Charlotte Mason junkie, and I've read many of her books many times. And volume 4, which is called Ourselves.
Okay, so talk to me like I don't
Yeah,
know
yeah, yeah.
anything.
Okay,
Who's
Charlotte Mason.
Charlotte Mason?
So Charlotte Mason was a British educator in the Victorian era, and she was on the cutting edge of developing. She did research for decades, like her whole life from the age of 16 to when she died, 80 years. She devoted to teaching and researching what's best for children.
Children.
What is best? So at the heart of classical education should be the question, what is best for a child? That's what the question should always be.
And
Always.
I would say, who is God and who is man? Right.
Yes.
Like,
Right. Right.
what are we doing here? What's our telos? Why
Exactly.
are we here?
That's right. That's right. That's right. And so in order to get to that, though, to educate a child, you have to say what is best for a child in order to select the way you're going to educate them.
Right.
And so she spent her life doing that. She was Anglican, and I homeschooled my children, very devoted to following and figuring out her philosophy. And she, in her volume 4 of the book called Ourselves, which is a beautiful, absolutely beautiful book that she wrote for her middle school students. So it's designed to be read by children between the ages of 11 and 14. And it's an
Oh,
absolutely beautiful book, and it's an allegory. And she talks about how the human person is a kingdom within and how a kingdom operates. And at the end of that book, she quotes Augustine, and she talks about how it's okay to not have the answers to everything. And so we have this logical nature, and in the West, we really want to embrace having logical answers for everything, right?
mhm.
And so she kind of goes to this point where she talks about it's okay to ask the questions. Why does a bird have feathers? And why are the feathers designed the way they are? And why does this bird have red feathers and this bird has blue feathers? And it's okay to have these mysteries and not ever have an answer to them, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's actually at the heart of classical education. And so we get to this point of um, thinking that classical education, because we're Western, instead of thinking big picture, okay,
Uh-huh.
we're thinking compartmentally. And because we are 21st century people, we're thinking compartmentally, and we don't understand that. So we want things to have a logical answer, a logical solution. We want to have data, right?
Right.
And so the beauty of a real classical education, if you understand the way the medievals thought and the way the early church
So
thought about,
pre-materialistic philosophy.
yes. So if you understand, like from Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis, and you read the early church fathers, and you understand the perspective of the cosmos and the order of the cosmos and how they looked at the world and the universe, it was nothing like we look at it now.
Right.
And so the idea of having to understand everything logically wasn't really there. They were okay with embracing mystery. And so we hear this grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and we think we have to have these compartments, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not really the way the trivium operated. Um, it became compartmentalized because of
Mm.
interpretations of Aristotle's writings.
Would that be like a neoclassical, like that happened sometime during the Renaissance period when they rediscovered these guys and then started, or like
Yeah,
rediscovered the trivium
right. So there's almost
and then
like,
started putting a materialistic lens on it?
yeah, so there's almost like
Okay.
these layers of neoclassical. By that mean
Okay.
we mean new classical, a new classical. It's
Okay.
not really the tradition. It's kind of a spin-off of what the tradition was to fit our modern society. But if parents are really looking for the beauty of a classical education,
Mm-hmm.
the
Okay.
neoclassical movement, in my opinion, is lacking beauty. So I think there's some truth and there's some goodness in the neoclassical movement,
Sure.
but it's very much lacking beauty because it's lacking this embracing of mystery and how important it is to be okay with not knowing everything or be okay with not having a box to put something in. And
Like
so,
this is a beautiful work of art. Maybe I can't tell you exactly why.
yes,
It just touches my soul.
right. And in fact, Cathy, this is a whole nother thing about beauty. I was just thinking about this week how I think so. There are actual classical educators who think we can talk about truth and goodness, but beauty isn't important. It's right. And so, how can you
Hmm.
define beauty and have a truth to beauty? Well, if you go back and look at the tradition, beauty always has form, beauty never has chaos. So, if you look at modern art, there's a lot of chaos and there's not form. So, it's not beautiful. Okay. So, there is a truth to beauty. And the
Hmm. There's a truth
early
to beauty.
fathers of education understood this. They defined it for us. It got warped through the progress of the Industrial Revolution. Um, but beauty has a mystery, and that's part of what makes it beautiful. I mean, you
Mm.
think about a child, a baby being born. You know, I'm sorry, but a baby, we do know the science behind how a baby is made. But if you really think about a baby, they are a mystery because they're more than just material. And there's a lot of mystery behind who we are as people.
Yes.
We are all beautiful. And so classical education should be for everyone. And I think the downfall of the original fathers of classical education was that it was only for the elite.
Right. And what about this argument? Well, that's just for academic people. That's just
Right.
for brainiac nerds.
Right.
See, that rubs me wrong because I'm like, so this child over here who's not a brainiac doesn't deserve truth, beauty, and virtue? Like, what does that
Right.
even mean?
And that comes from pride. And at the heart of a real classical education is humility.
Ooh, that's good.
It not the other thing we have to think about is the Christian church, early church fathers like St. Augustine. I absolutely love St. Augustine. So they understood how to take the secular classical education that they had been given and take the beauty and the truth and the goodness from it, but put Christ into it, right? So that it would be
That's right.
full, right?
Yes.
And so Augustine is one of my favorite people to look back to. And St. Athanasius on the Incarnation, absolutely beautiful. If you want to learn logic and the progression of logic, I would read on the Incarnation, honestly, because
like when Saint, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, he does logic, but he does it so in such a simple way. It's not complicated. So Aquinas does it, but it's complicated. If you want to teach logic to students, read on the Incarnation.
Well, I think St. Paul does that too. I think it's in Romans where he does this whole laying out, and you're like, because we're not trained to think that way. And he was obviously trained in the philosophy of the day.
Right.
And you're like, okay, but this, then that. So sometimes it's hard for us to follow. But so many of the church fathers, Gregory, Basil, John Chrysostom, St. Gregory Palamas, they were all trained in secular philosophy,
right,
but then devoted their lives to the practice of their faith.
Right. So they refined the model of what we would call classical education, but made it with Christ at the center, and they made it beautiful. And that's what I'm trying to recover. Okay. So back to the neoclassical, the problem with the neoclassical movement, and I would say, okay, how did it start? It started through Dorothy Sayers wrote this essay called The Lost Tools of Learning. Dorothy Sayers was a medieval expert. She was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis, a friend of C.S. Lewis.
And Tolkien, right?
Like brilliant lady. I mean, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And she wrote detective novels, and she was just great. I mean, she's written Mind of the Maker, fantastic book. She wrote this essay, and it was literally just an essay. And she said at the beginning of the essay, this is just an idea. It would be preposterous for anybody to try to make a school out of this idea. She actually alluded to that. If you read the essay carefully, it's right there. I was like, ooh, she said that right there. And what happened was some people that were homeschooling and realizing, God bless their hearts, realizing they needed to help make a solution for Christian parents that didn't want to send their kids to public school because of the disaster it was in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s. And they read her essay and thought, wow, this is a good idea. Let's create a school off of this essay. And in the heart of the essay, she was kind of laying forth this idea that the trivium, which is the three arts of language, are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And she talks about K5 being the grammar stage where children are this parrot pole stage and just memory work and recitation and regurgitating facts. Then the logic, teenagers are kind of wanting to use logic to rebel and fight against their parents. They're kind of in that stage where they're in that mode of thinking. And then high schoolers are in this rhetoric stage where they're ready to defend their argument. Okay. So they took that idea where it was really truly a partial idea because she was a medievalist, so she knew what the trivium really was, which was not that. But she was tying it to modern Freudian cognitive child psychology
Development.
ideas.
Okay.
Just honestly, I think she wrote the essay just as a conversation, sort of like if any of us had an idea, we wanted to talk about it, we would post it on Facebook or on a blog and let's talk about this idea. I don't think it was meant to become this philosophy for schools, right? So these schools embraced it. Books were written to support it. And then it's been happening for all these years. And like a lot of classical schools have used this idea of the trivium as stages, K5 grammar, 7 through 8 or 6 through 8 logic or dialectic, and high school rhetoric. But many of these schools are realizing, well, it doesn't really work. And the reason it doesn't work is because you're compartmentalizing a human being.
Right. And we do those things all the time in sloppy ways from the time we're.
And this is interesting. We actually want checklists and we want to compartmentalize because that's how we were raised.
Right.
That's how the school system we were brought up in did that. And so, and we like to categorize things. And I think that's a human thing to categorize things, but it's actually better to let a child learn things and categorize things in their own way than to tell them how to categorize things. Let them create their own categories.
We have like teaching the trivium, and we've got Susan Wise Bauer, and we've got the well-trained mind, and then you've got classical conversations, and then you've got norms of nobility, and then you've got Charlotte Mason, and so we have and we've got the Latin Center curriculum. I can't remember who the author of that was, but everybody's coming to the table with all of these opinions and ideas about what is classicism, and it's not that. It's like the elephant, everybody's blind touching the elephant, right? Like everybody has a piece of, okay, this is what it feels like. So it's not that that's all wrong. I would say it may not all be holistic or complete in and of itself.
Right. And I think one of the things that disturbs me, I've never gone public with this. In one of the books I'm not going to mention who it is, but in one of the books of the philosophies you just mentioned, she actually likens a child to their mind being like shelves in a grocery store that you have to stock.
Yeah, kind of like the computer analogy, like we're a computer or we're mechanical.
Yeah, and you're like, nope, not, that's not classical, and that's not how it was viewed ever.
Oh, I see. Okay, so like a blank, like tabula rasa.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, and you've got these grocery store shelves in your mind that have to be filled.
They're empty. And stuff has
stock them. Right.
Certain kind of stuff, certain amount of stuff. Okay.
Right. And that's, to be honest with you, that's inhumane and it's not classical. So classical education is educating the heart and mind and the soul of the person and giving them living experiences that allow the Holy Spirit to speak to the child, that this teacher steps back. This is where Charlotte Mason is so much more in line with the tradition of the classical education fathers. The teacher steps back and allows the beauty from the text. The text could be a leaf from a tree. It could be a picture, it could be a song, it could be a poem, it could be from literature, from a story about Einstein, biography.
So she lets the child engage with the text.
She lets the child engage, and the child then tell back. This is where narration is powerful. She talks about narration. Tell back what they got from it. So instead of spoon feeding the child what you think they should have gotten from it, or asking them comprehension questions that you think they need to know, you allow the child to digest it and then tell you what they got out of it. That is actually more in line with the fathers of the early and you can see that in Plato's dialogues very clearly, because he's asking questions that help the person learn how to think.
Right.
And Charlotte Mason was not against Socratic questioning at all. Her principles were founded upon narration, which is very much a classical tradition. And Quintilian, I love Quintilian. He wrote a lot about it. And he actually said that narration is an art. It's not a tool for assessments. That's another problem. Neoclassical movement is using narration as a tool for assessments. Narration is not a tool for assessments. Narration is an art. So by that, I mean, if you're an art teacher and you're teaching students how to draw, okay, you have some guidelines on that, but how do you grade that? Think about that when you're grading narrations. So your rubrics, if you will, for grading narrations are really loose. They're not this checklist. It's not a tool for you to give the kids a grade. And that's a problem that I see in a lot of classical schools, a lot of neoclassical mindset is that narration is a tool. It's not a tool. It's an art.
Now, I have heard you, and I don't know how, I mean, I would probably shouldn't go too deep into this, but I have heard you compare and contrast mimetic teaching with narration. And I hear a lot of people say, including myself, what is mimetic teaching? What does that mean?
Okay. So in our newsletter, if you sign up for our newsletter,
At classical education.
classical education podcast.com, and you go to the consulting tab.
Okay.
In there, I have a sign up for the newsletter. If you sign up for the newsletter, you'll immediately get our newsletter on mimetic teaching. And actually this month we're putting out our part 1 of 3 on neoclassical versus classical.
Okay.
So that'll be interesting.
Great. So I'll just link to that on our page.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we only send out 1 newsletter a month, and it's very academic. It's several pages. It's worth your reading. It has references.
You have a podcast on iTunes.
We have a podcast.
Okay.
It's on everything. It's on every major
platform.
Outlet.
Okay.
Classical.
But anyway,
The podcast is just classical education.
So mimetic teaching is obviously from the word to mime or to mimic.
To imitate. And at the heart of mimetic teaching is just intuition. It's just the way we learn. We imitate everything. So, I mean, this is obvious with children, babies, they learn how to talk because they're immersed in the environment of communication, and they learn how to talk. And so they imitate everything. Well, mimetic learning isn't something that is steps you have to follow. Mimetic learning is just presenting. So let me back up a little bit. Children are going to learn through imitation because that's how we were wired to learn. The Bible tells us to imitate Christ. That's our number one calling. As Christians, our number one calling is to imitate Christ. And it's hard.
Which I would call attaining virtue. That's what I would say about that.
So imitating Christ is hard. I mean, every day we fall, every day we wake up, we try to imitate Christ, and we fall 10,000 times. But that's our number one calling, is to imitate Christ and to become like Christ. We are hardwired to imitate because our number one calling is to imitate Christ. So because we're hardwired to imitate, we need to teach through imitation. Okay. That means what Plato was saying in the Republic. What we have to do is be careful what we're giving students to imitate, because if we give them crap to imitate, they're going to become crappy people.
So if we put truth, beauty, and virtue in front of them and say, look at these things.
So this is where classical education is super easy, super intuitive, super easy. It's not complicated. You actually don't need to buy a curriculum. I'm not here to sell anything. I'm never going to sell anything like this. Classical education is about giving students the best of all there is to offer. The best of humanity, the best of everything that there is. The best music, the best art, the best literature, the best stories of people like Galileo, all the famous people, that have done great things, reading good biographies that are written well, so good writing. So a classical education is about introducing students to all of the best of everything and giving them the opportunity to absorb it and tell it back what they've learned. And when they're doing that, they're imitating because they're learning to think. They're learning how to, So narration is about telling back every detail you can remember from what you just learned about.
Right.
And using the vocabulary from what you just, so it's important to give them living books, meaning books that are written really well in a literary style, so that they can tell back what they've learned and they're being exposed to beautiful language. Okay. The most beautiful language. And the more they're exposed to it, the more they tell back what they got out of it, the closer they are to becoming a good imitator.
Okay, so then what is mimetic teaching then as compared to that thing that you just said?
Mimetic teaching is having students imitate from what you've given them.
So is that a good thing?
Mm-hmm. Right. So you want to give them beautiful poetry that they can copy. So copy work with good handwriting. And this is where habit training comes in and virtue. So having them copy anything that's beautiful from something that was been written. And in fact, Charlotte Mason even said, expose the children to a lot of things and then ask them, what do you want to copy? So let them kind of have some decision in all of that.
I guess I was thinking I had heard you compare and contrast narration to mimetic, and that mimetic was
no,
kind of
narration
negative.
falls under mimetic. It is so copy work is a type of mimetic learning. Narration is a type of mimetic learning. Mimetic writing is where you give them something that's beautiful and you ask them to imitate it. And there's the progymnasmata, which is 14, I think it's 14, I always forget if it's 14 steps. And the progymnasmata is amazing. And that's like a whole podcast I have to do. But
that's classical writing for those
classical
of you who
writing,
don't know.
And it's all mimetic. All of it is mimetic.
Okay.
So
I don't
you're
know
imitating.
why I got in my head that this was a negative thing. I don't know why.
But here's what's so cool about mimetic. I love this part about mimetic, that it also allows us to be creative. So as being created in the image of God, we are designed to imitate Christ, but we are also designed to create, right? So part of our nature is to imitate, but another part of our nature is to create. Well, we learn how to create beautiful things by imitating. So the progymnasmata teaches us how to imitate beautiful writing. And so, but we get to be creative with it. So for instance, the very first stage of the progymnasmata is the fable stage.
Right.
And so let's say the kids are reading a fable, one of the Aesop's fables, and you read it, you narrate it, and then you ask them, extend the ending of that fable. What happened next? Or, okay, let's rewrite the fable and add dialogue, because a lot of the fables don't have dialogue. Or let's give character names. Let's extend the ending and add more characters, add dialogue, what happens next. So this is where we're imitating good writing, because we're taking a really good piece of writing and we're using that same style. So they're learning what style is, which is one of the 5 canons of rhetoric. Okay. They're learning style. They're learning what the good style is of good writing. And then they're adding another paragraph that matches that style, but they're adding things like dialogue. And so this teaches so many parts of the elements of English language naturally. They're learning to imitate, but they're also learning how to be creative.
Okay, that all makes sense. Now you mentioned, and I don't know if we have time to go into this, but I'm sure you will write on this later if you haven't already, 5 canons of rhetoric.
Oh, yeah. So the 5 canons.
Where is that from? What's that about?
No, I don't actually know where it's from.
I think it's pretty old. I think it's Greek.
Oh, yeah, it definitely is Greek, but I'm not sure if it's it might be from Aristotle, or it could be a compilation of things. That's a good thing to look up to find out the root of it. But the 5 canons are, and I don't know if I have the order.
It may be Aristotle, it may be because it's Aristotelian.
It's probably Aristotelian.
5 common topics.
Yeah. So the 5 canons of rhetoric are like style, now see, you're putting me on the spot. I know what they are, but I don't have them in front of me.
It's okay.
Style is one of them. Invention is another one.
And then within invention, we have those 5 common topics within that.
But you want to tell me want to tell you a really cool secret? I've not really gone public with this either. Narration. I figured this out. I want to publish it and I want to put it in a book. Narration covers all 5 canons of rhetoric. So if you want your kids to learn the 5 canons, they need to narrate. All 5 canons happen. And
I want to see you explore that.
Oh, it's amazing. When I realized it, my mind was blown. I was walking on clouds for days when I figured this out. So narration covers all 5 canons of rhetoric. Narration is the most complete writing curriculum. And I don't want to call it a curriculum. It is the most complete
Process.
form of, a process or form of learning how to be a good writer. Because with narration, you process everything first through verbal. And if you can't communicate well verbally, you can't write well. And so narration touches on listening, thinking, processing, then inventing, right?
How am I going to tell this back?
Organizing,
Yeah.
putting it in order,
Mm-hmm.
and then creating sentences, pulling some imitation, pulling some of the vocabulary from what you heard in the story,
Right.
bringing it all together, and then verbalizing it. And so students need to do verbal oral narration for many years before they do written. But once they've been doing this, then when they do written narration, what they're doing is imitative writing, but they're creating it in their own style. So there's invention is in there, right? So it's really cool once you understand the depths and the breadth and the depth of narration. It's so classical. So I want to circle back to Quintilian. Quintilian actually said that narration was the best and most important lost art that the Greeks had been practicing.
Wow. And okay, who is Quintilian? When did he live?
Oh,
And
he
who was
lived
he?
around about 100 years after Christ. He followed
Okay.
in the footsteps of Cicero,
Okay.
and he
Is he Greek? Sounds kind of Greek.
Roman. He was Roman.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and he was a Roman. I think he was an attorney, but he was also a teacher. And so he
Okay.
was a teacher of rhetoric primarily. And he was asked, after teaching for 20, 30 years, he was asked to write a book about how he taught all the boys that he taught for 20 years.
Okay.
It's a brilliant book. The orations,
The
oratory.
orations.
Yeah, yeah. It's so good and it's very accessible. It's so wonderful. It's an amazing book, and it's been translated well. But he talks about what rhetoric is and how to teach children. And it's very similar to Charlotte Mason. And so you read this stuff and you're like, yeah, Charlotte Mason is true to the tradition here.
So
And
Adrienne, I
I
mean,
see it
like,
in Aristotle too with habit training. Aristotle was, he had 11 virtues, and he talks habit training is huge. Soul formation is huge. Aristotle had a lot of things that were very, very close to, I'm not going to say, he wasn't a Christian, but a lot of it aligns nicely with being a Christian and what we believe about habit formation and becoming a virtuous person and overcoming our vices and replacing our vices with virtue. A lot of this was Aristotelian teaching.
Okay. So who does this matter to? I mean, what about
Everyone.
public school teachers? I mean, they're stuck with star testing and they're stuck with all these crazy scope and sequence things, and they got to teach to this test. I mean, should they care about this? I mean, is it just for homeschoolers? Is it just for elite, Northeastern private schools for, the elite of our country? Like, who should care about this stuff?
Well, a real liberal education is for all, and liberal education is the heart of classical education, which the liberal arts, there's 7. So there's the trivium and quadrivium. Trivium is the 3 parts, logic or grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or dialectic and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and arithmetic. Oh, come on. I know these. It's because I'm tired. It's late. It's almost
Like
10
a
o'clock.
natural science thing?
Yeah, no, it's arithmetic, music, geometry. I can't even believe I'm blanking on the 4th one because no, arithmetic, music. I'll get back to it. I can't even believe I'm blanking on this because it's so intuitive to me to know it. I just can't even believe it's embarrassing. But so the 7 liberal arts traditionally are, but today, if you think, so I went to Kent State University, which is a liberal arts university. I never heard of these 7 things when I was in college. So the whole term liberal arts has been adulterated big time. It's not what it used to be. What the 7 liberal arts was originally is the arts, the primary arts of learning how to be a civilized, cultured, virtuous person. well educated in wisdom. Okay.
So here's what it means to be a
Towards
virtuous,
wisdom.
wise human. You need to know kind of this group of things.
Yep. It's your basic knowledge, so that then you can then you can pursue theology, was kind of the idea.
But more like tools, not like stocking shelves. So like these are your
I wouldn't even
tools.
call them tools. I would call it a knowledge base.
Okay.
So that then you can study theology and go God to wisdom is the next step. Okay. And so so these are the kind of the foundation of wisdom. But I would argue there used to be 9 liberal arts, not 7. The other 2 were medicine and architecture, which are now considered more like in the not the common arts exactly, but like your common arts would be like craftsmen, like blacksmithing, agriculture. And I don't think medicine and architecture were exactly in the common arts, but they were kind of in that realm over there of vocation and more trades, I guess.
So like expressing beauty with your hands, with what you can make.
Yeah, and the 7 liberal arts were more geared towards these are the 7 subjects that you need to study to then be able to study theology, whereas architecture and medicine didn't really fit into that, if that makes sense. So originally there were 9 and then it came down to 7. I actually would love to go back to the 9. I think it's interesting. They went to 7 because 7 was the perfect number in the church, so and so and it kind of came from the book The Marriage of Philology, and see, it's so late at night, I'm having a hard time remembering, but I know where it came from. And anyhow, I think that these 7 liberal arts are important, but I also think that for the modern man, we ought to look at them and not be so married to them that we're forgetting that a human being also should be educated in the common arts, like how to grow plants. Do you see? How to work with your hands, how to make instruments, how to do these very human things. And it's interesting because Aristotle, he actually said we ought to be. So a lot of the definitions of classical education, they'll talk about how classical education is an education in virtue of mind, mind and body. No, see, I'm tired, Cathy. I'm sorry. I'm fumbling around here. But one thing that I don't see in a lot of definitions of classical education is the education of the body. And I think that Aristotle had that as one of the education virtues that should be studied and developed and cultivated. It's in Plato's Republic, gymnastics. And I think that we are so focused on academics that we have left out the importance of developing the whole person and allowing them to have an education in things that involve the body. So, gymnastics, obviously, sports and stuff can be part of that, but I think that gardening is part of that. There are things that involve physical work, smithery, the blacksmithing and metallurgy. I mean, like when I was in high school, I had to take metallurgy and I had to take home economics, learning how to cook. And I think that that's something that ought to be brought back into classical schools. I think we're so focused on this academic model that we've lost the idea of developing the whole person. Does that make sense?
It does. Are you familiar with the American College of Building Arts? You would love it. That's exactly what you're talking about. And it's geared toward history. It's geared toward homes. So anyway, or historical buildings. Okay. So I love all of that. And I think that is a good, I mean, it's not a precise, we don't have a 1-sentence elevator speech on what is this, but it's more complicated than that.
Because we're humans.
Because we're human.
We are not We are very complicated.
We are.
And we can all agree on that. That's why we
Yeah.
all argue with each other all the time, because we're complicated. But I think that also is a good reason to embrace the good teaching in classical education, which I would say is learning how to communicate, learning how to listen, to think. This is what narration does, to speak carefully, formulate your words. And then Socratic dialogue teaches you how to have civil discourse, teaches you how to go back to the text and let's see what the text is saying. We're not inserting our opinions here. We're talking about what is in front of us. And so these teaching from original source documents when they're learning real history, the original source documents, you can start pretty young, but more with K5, you want to teach history from a narrative perspective. And it doesn't matter if all the facts aren't exact. You want them to just get the overview of the narrative. The facts come later when you can present original source documents to them when they're a little older.
Okay.
And so that's another thing with the neoclassical movement. I'm not a fan of regurgitating facts just for the sake of them to have facts. What you want them to do is memorize things that are beautiful and meaningful, which is actually more true to the tradition. So you would want them to memorize things like scripture, beautiful poetry, things that are memory to the heart, right? Things that penetrate the soul, not things like chanting things like an adjective describes a noun, an adjective describes a noun, like these little chants, or, the dates and the eras of things. That's not classical at all whatsoever. In the medieval mindset of classical education, they had mind palaces. And this is where I'm kind of going back to even the idea of allowing the kids to grasp what they grasp and organize it their own way. That's what a mind palace is. They're creating in their mind their own organizational system based on what they are picking up out of the lesson. And it could be something totally different than what you thought they should have gotten out of the lesson. But you know what? We have to let the Holy Spirit speak to our children when we're teaching them. That's how we learn. We learn through the Holy Spirit is who gives us revelation. The Holy Spirit knows that child better than you do. And they may need to learn something from that lesson that you never even saw. And I'm telling you, if you teach this way, your mind is blown. You learn so much from a child because you hear them and you're like, I never thought of it that way. I never saw that. But that's what they needed to get out of it. And you just let it be. And you know what's beautiful too about classical education is you always circle back to the same ideas over and over and over. So they have this layer that gets built. So these students will have this understanding over here when they're 8, but they'll come back to it again when they're 14, and it'll layer upon layer of knowledge. It's beautiful, Cathy.
Okay, so for those of
Beautiful.
us most of us did not have an education that was anything like this. Most of us went to public school that was not classical. And then if we got a teaching degree, we got it from maybe a state university where we didn't learn about any of this. Maybe we don't know any history of education. We didn't know that there was, we've never even heard of these people or these things. So you are going to offer teacher training at some point, or some sort of seminars online or something like that for the average
I can.
teacher?
I already do a lot for schools.
Okay,
And
so for private schools.
any schools. I do charter schools, everything. And I have a consulting team of people that are experts that I've been really working closely with for many years. I trust them. We have the same understanding of neoclassical and classical. And these are teachers who have been doing it in the classroom across the board, from charter schools to private Christian, Catholic, Protestant schools. And so we do work with all kinds of schools and homeschools. So
Okay.
yeah, and then I've spoken at some conferences. I'm going to be teaching at a conference in a couple weeks, and then I would love to have a conference with you maybe next year. That would be awesome, because
North Texas
it'd be great.
Classical Education Conference.
Be awesome.
I think that'd be great. And I would love to see resources out there for, your average public school teacher who doesn't make a lot and their administration isn't going to do this probably for any kind of continuing education or professional development. So I would love, and I will post as much as possible resources so that we can all get in this mindset, because I think now more than ever, we need to be educating the whole human, because our world wants to focus them narrowly on devices and on non-human things and on technological things. We're seeing some sort of bizarre move to almost a transhumanism, where we're so connected to devices and machines all the time that we don't interact with each other or literature or what. Everything is through this filter of a screen. Like even if it's literature, it's still filtered through this device. Yeah.
It's tragic. It's scary. And we can do better than that.
Sure. I think so too. So you're helping with that. So I do want you to feel free to post, any resources that you have in the group, and we can make rooms in the group or little side, because we're obviously, I'm in Wise County, you're in Denton County. We've got people in the group from Grayson County, Tarrant County already, so great. Okay. Well, so please do feel free to continue to do that, and we will work together. And for me, what I want to see is education for educators, that there is a better way to educate humans.
This is awesome. We're on the same page.
Great. Well, I love it. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Cathy.
Thanks, Adrienne.